I trusted my wife for 12 years, and I never once questioned where she was, who she was with, or what she was doing. Until the day I realized the man driving my car, the guy I barely even noticed, was the same person she had been secretly meeting behind my back. And the moment it finally clicked wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, cold, and instant. Like everything in my life suddenly made sense in the worst possible way. Before all of this happened, my life was simple, not perfect, not some movie version of happiness, but stable, predictable, real. I'm in my early 40s, and for the past several years, I've been running a small logistics business. It's not the kind of thing people dream about, but it pays well. And more importantly, it gave me control over my time, my routine, my life. And that mattered to me. Because everything I was building for us, for me and my wife. We had been together for almost 12 years. 12 years of routines, habits, inside jokes, shared responsibilities. The kind of time that makes you stop questioning things. You don't wake up every day wondering if your relationship is real. You just live in it. That's where I was. We had a house in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing flashy, but comfortable. The kind of place where everything has its spot, where you know exactly how your day is going to look before it even starts. Mornings were always the same. I'd wake up a little earlier, go to the kitchen, make coffee. A few minutes later, she'd walk in, still half asleep, hair slightly messy, wearing one of those oversized sweaters she liked. We didn't talk much at first. We didn't have to. That silence was normal, comfortable. Then the day would start. Work calls, meetings, driving across the city, dealing with clients, problems, deadlines. It wasn't easy, but it was manageable. And every time things got stressful, I had this one thought in the back of my mind. At least everything at home is solid. That thought kept me grounded, and she was part of that. She wasn't just my wife. She was part of the structure of my life. The person I came back to at the end of the day. The one constant that didn't change, no matter what happened outside. We weren't overly emotional people. We didn't have dramatic fights or big romantic gestures every week. But we had consistency. We had trust. Or at least, I believed we did. About a year ago, things started to shift. Not in our relationship, not directly. It was more practical than that. My business started growing faster than I expected. More clients, more deliveries, more responsibilities. I found myself constantly on the move, always late, always multitasking, answering calls while driving, checking emails at traffic lights, trying to squeeze too much into one day. It got to the point where driving stopped being just driving. It became wasted time. That's when the idea of hiring a driver came up. At first, I didn't like it. It felt unnecessary, almost arrogant, like I was trying to pretend I was something bigger than I actually was. But after a few weeks of running on stress and tight schedules, I gave in. It wasn't about status. It was about efficiency. That's how Mark came into our life. He wasn't impressive. That's the first thing I remember about him. He didn't try to stand out, didn't talk too much, didn't ask unnecessary questions. He just showed up on time, did his job, and stayed out of the way. The kind of person you don't pay attention to, which, at the time, felt perfect. I didn't need a friend. I didn't need conversation. I needed someone reliable. And he was. At first, he only drove me. Office, meetings, back home. Simple routine. But over time, it expanded. Sometimes my wife needed to go somewhere. Groceries, appointments, meeting a friend. If I didn't need the car, it just made sense for him to take her. It was practical, convenient, normal. I never stopped to think about it. Why would I? He worked for us. He was part of the system. And she was my wife. That combination, in my mind, was untouchable. Looking back now, that's the part that's hardest to accept. Not what happened, but how easy I made it for it to happen. Because when you trust someone completely, you don't see risk. You don't see patterns. You don't see what's right in front of you. You just live your life, assuming it's exactly what it looks like. And for a long time, I really believed it was. If I'm being honest, nothing changed all at once. And that's probably why I didn't react the way people expect when they hear stories like this. Because there was no single moment I could point to and say, that's where everything started to fall apart. Instead, it was a series of small, almost invisible details that, on their own, didn't mean anything, but together slowly began to feel wrong. At first, it was just a feeling I couldn't properly explain. The kind of quiet discomfort that sits somewhere in the background of your mind and doesn't go away even when you try to ignore it. And I remember telling myself more than once that I was probably just tired, that work was getting to me, that I was overthinking things that didn't actually matter. Because that's what you do when you trust someone. You don't assume betrayal. You look for reasons to doubt yourself instead. She didn't suddenly become a different person. She didn't act distant in an obvious way, and she didn't give me any clear reason to question her. But there were small shifts in her behavior that I started noticing without really trying to notice them. Like the way she began spending more time on her phone. Not in a secretive or dramatic way, but just enough that it felt different from before. Sometimes I would walk into a room and she would be texting, and she wouldn't hide it. But at the same time, she would slightly turn the screen away, almost instinctively, like it wasn't something she was fully aware of doing. And those moments were so subtle that I couldn't call them out without sounding unreasonable. So I didn't say anything. I just registered them. And then there were the times she started going out more often, usually for simple reasons that made complete sense on the surface, like running errands, meeting someone, or just needing to get out of the house for a bit. And none of that was unusual by itself, but the timing slowly stopped lining up the way it used to. She would say she'd be gone for an hour, and it would turn into 2. She would mention one place, but later something about the story wouldn't fully connect. Not enough to accuse, but enough to notice. And that's the part people don't really talk about. How your mind reacts in those moments. Because it doesn't jump straight to the worst conclusion, it actually does the opposite. It works hard to protect the version of reality you're used to. It tries to explain everything in the safest, most logical way possible. She probably got delayed. Traffic was bad. Plans changed. There's always an explanation if you want there to be one. And I wanted there to be one. I remember one specific evening that stayed with me longer than the others. Not because something big happened, but because of how small and precise the moment was, and how it made me feel in a way I couldn't ignore afterward. I came home earlier than usual that day, without telling her in advance, and when I walked into the house, everything felt unusually quiet. Not empty, just still, like I had stepped into a moment I wasn't supposed to interrupt, and I found her sitting on the couch with her phone in her hand. The second she noticed me, there was a slight pause, barely noticeable, and then she locked the screen almost immediately and put the phone down beside her. And if you looked at it from the outside, it was nothing, just a natural reaction to someone entering the room, but in that moment it felt too quick, too automatic. We looked at each other for a second. Then she smiled, and I smiled back. And neither of us said anything about it. That silence was important. Because it wasn't empty, it was a decision. A quiet agreement to pretend that nothing unusual had just happened. And I went along with it, not because I didn't notice, but because noticing something like that puts you in a position where you have to choose what to do next. And I wasn't ready to ask questions that could change everything. So I did what most people do in that situation. I let it go. At least on the surface. But the thing is, once something like that registers in your mind, it doesn't just disappear. It stays there, somewhere in the background, and every new detail you notice starts connecting to it, slowly forming a pattern you don't want to see, but can't completely ignore anymore. And without realizing it, I had already started paying attention. Not actively, not intentionally, but enough to feel that something in my life, something I had always considered stable and predictable, was no longer as solid as I thought it was. And that feeling was only getting stronger. The feeling didn't disappear, and no matter how much I tried to push it to the side and focus on work, routine, or anything else that felt stable and predictable, it kept coming back in small, quiet moments when I wasn't expecting it. And over time, it stopped being just a vague discomfort and started turning into something more specific. Something that felt like a pattern I was slowly beginning to recognize. At that point, I wasn't looking for proof, and I definitely wasn't ready to admit to myself what I was actually thinking. But I had started noticing details in a different way, not as isolated moments, but as parts of something that might be connected, even if I didn't fully understand how yet. One of the things that stood out the most was the car. It sounds small, almost irrelevant, but when your life is built around routines, even small changes in those routines become noticeable, especially when they don't quite make sense. And since I was the one managing the business, I had access to the tracking system we used for our vehicles, something I normally only checked for work-related reasons. At first, it was accidental. I wasn't checking on her. I was checking on the car. That's what I told myself, and technically, it was true. But one day, when she told me she was going to a specific place, somewhere simple and familiar, I happened to glance at the app later, and what I saw didn't match what she had said. Not exactly, not clearly, but enough to make me stop and look a second time. The car wasn't where it was supposed to be. It was parked in a different part of the city, not near any stores she usually went to, not near any places I recognized as part of her routine, just somewhere else, somewhere that didn't have an obvious explanation. I remember staring at the screen longer than I should have, trying to come up with a logical reason, something that would immediately make sense and allow me to move on without thinking about it again, because at that moment, I still wasn't ready to let my mind go where it was starting to go. And eventually, I did what I had been doing this entire time. I explained it away. Maybe she stopped somewhere else. Maybe plans changed. Maybe I misunderstood something. There was always a maybe. There always is. But the difference this time was that the thought didn't fully settle. It didn't disappear the way it usually did. And instead, it stayed in the back of my mind, quietly waiting, like something unfinished. Later that day, when she came home, I asked her about it, but I did it casually, carefully, making sure my tone didn't sound accusatory, because I didn't want to start something I couldn't control. "Hey, where did you go earlier?" I asked, like it was just part of a normal conversation, and she answered immediately, too quickly. Without hesitation, without thinking. She named the exact place she had mentioned before. The place that didn't match the location I saw. And in that moment, something shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that would be obvious from the outside, but internally, something stopped feeling stable. Because it wasn't just about the location anymore. It was about the way she answered, the speed of it, the confidence. Like the response was already prepared. I didn't confront her. I didn't push further. I just nodded and let the conversation move on, like nothing important had just happened. But inside, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Because now it wasn't just a feeling. It was a contradiction, and contradictions are harder to dismiss. After that, I started noticing something else. Something I hadn't paid attention to before. Something that, looking back, feels obvious in a way that almost makes me question how I didn't see it earlier. Mark, the driver. He had always been there, part of the routine, part of the background. Someone who did his job without drawing attention to himself. And maybe that's exactly why I never looked at him twice, because there was never a reason to. But now, for the first time, I started thinking about how often he was involved in her day. How often he was the one driving her. How often they were in the same space, without me. And once that thought appeared, it didn't leave. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it didn't make sense, that I was connecting things that weren't actually connected. But the more I thought about it, the more it started to feel less like a random idea and more like a possibility I couldn't fully dismiss anymore. Not because I had proof, but because for the first time, the situation had a shape, a direction, something that explained the small things that didn't make sense before. And even then, I wasn't ready to believe it, because believing it would mean accepting something I wasn't prepared to face. So instead of confronting it directly, I did something else, something quieter, something that felt safer. I started watching, not in an obvious way, not in a way that would expose what I was thinking, but just enough to see if the pattern would continue, if the details would line up, if what I was starting to suspect would reveal itself without me having to force it. And deep down, I think I already knew it would. After that, it stopped feeling like a coincidence, and even though I never said it out loud, not to her, and not even fully to myself, I had already crossed a line internally. Because once you start seeing a pattern, you don't go back to the way things felt before. You don't return to that blind trust that made everything simple. Instead, every small detail begins to carry weight. Every action starts to feel like it might mean something more. I didn't confront her. I didn't accuse her. I didn't even change my behavior in any obvious way. From the outside, everything stayed exactly the same. I went to work, handled my business, came home, sat at the same table, had the same conversations, and followed the same routine we had built over the years. But internally, something had shifted, and I was no longer just living my life. I was observing it, paying attention in a way I never had before. Not constantly, not obsessively, but enough to notice what I had been ignoring for a long time. And what I started noticing didn't help. If anything, it made things worse. There were more moments with her phone, more small movements that felt automatic, like she had gotten used to hiding things without even realizing it. And what made it harder was that none of it was dramatic enough to call out directly, because each individual moment could still be explained, still be dismissed if I chose to look at it that way. But I was running out of explanations. And then there was him, Mark. I began to see him differently. Not because he had changed, but because I had started looking at him with a different perspective. And once that shift happens, you begin to notice things that were always there, but never registered before. The way he avoided eye contact sometimes. The way he kept conversations short when she was around. The way there were small pauses, almost unnoticeable, when the three of us were in the same space. Again, nothing clear, nothing undeniable. But enough to make the silence between those details feel heavier. One day, something happened that I can't forget. Not because it was obvious, but because it was the first moment where everything felt real. I got into the car earlier than usual, without warning, and Mark was already there. The second I opened the door, I could feel it. That tension, the kind that doesn't need words to exist. He looked at me, but only briefly, and then immediately focused on the road, gripping the steering wheel a little tighter than usual. And when I asked him a simple question, just something normal, something routine, his answer came out slightly off, like his voice didn't fully match the situation. It was controlled, but not natural. And in that moment, I realized something important. This wasn't just in my head anymore. Because whatever I was feeling, he was feeling something too. And that changed everything. The drive itself was quiet, but not the comfortable kind of quiet I was used to. Instead, it felt heavy, stretched, like every second lasted longer than it should, and I found myself paying attention to things I would normally ignore, like the way he checked the rearview mirror. Not constantly, but just enough to make me notice. Not in a suspicious way, but not completely neutral either. And then there was something else. A detail so small that, on any other day, I would have ignored it completely. The smell. It was faint, barely noticeable, but it didn't belong. It wasn't mine, and it wasn't something I associated with the car before. And for a moment, I tried to convince myself it was nothing, that maybe someone else had been in the car earlier, that maybe I was imagining it, but the thought didn't settle. Because now, every small thing had context. Every detail had a place in the pattern that was forming whether I wanted it to or not. By the time that drive ended, I didn't feel confused anymore. I didn't feel uncertain. I felt something much worse. Clarity. Not complete, not supported by proof, but clear enough to understand what direction this was going in. Clear enough to realize that if I wanted answers, I wasn't going to get them by asking simple questions or pretending everything was normal. Something inside me had already made a decision. I just hadn't acted on it yet. That night, I barely slept. Not because I was shocked, but because my mind wouldn't stop replaying everything, every moment, every detail, every interaction that suddenly looked different when I saw it through this new perspective. And no matter how hard I tried to find an alternative explanation, something that would make all of this fall apart and return to normal, I couldn't. Because deep down, I was no longer trying to prove that nothing was happening. I was trying to understand how much of it was real. And that realization was the point where everything changed. Because the next step was no longer about noticing. It was about finding out the truth. And I knew exactly where I was going to look. After that night, something inside me changed in a way I can't really describe as a single decision or a sudden emotional break. Because it wasn't dramatic from the outside, and nobody around me would have noticed anything different. But internally, I had already crossed a point where I could no longer pretend that I didn't see what I was starting to see. And the only thing that remained uncertain was how far I was willing to go to confirm it. The next day felt normal on the surface, and that's what made it worse. Because life doesn't pause just because your mind is falling apart. It continues in the same rhythm, with the same responsibilities, the same conversations, the same routine that forces you to act like everything is still in place, even when it isn't. So I went to work, answered calls, handled problems, spoke to clients, and did everything I normally did. But in the background of every single moment, there was the same thought repeating itself without stopping. I need to know. Not, I think something is wrong. Not, maybe I'm overthinking. But a much simpler and heavier thought that doesn't leave space for excuses anymore. Because once you reach that point, you're no longer dealing with suspicion. You're dealing with necessity. That day, I paid attention differently. Not emotionally, not panicked, but in a quiet and controlled way. Like I was finally observing my own life from the outside. And the more I did that, the more details started to feel connected in a way I couldn't unsee anymore. Especially when it came to timing. Because timing is one of those things that people don't think about when everything is normal, but becomes painfully important when something feels off. She left the house in the afternoon, saying it was something simple, something routine, nothing that should have raised any concern, and I remember watching her for a moment longer than usual as she prepared to leave. Not because she did anything suspicious at that exact second, but because for the first time I wasn't just seeing her as my wife. I was seeing her as someone whose actions I could no longer take at face value. When she left, I waited. Not immediately doing anything, just sitting there for a while, trying to calm the part of my mind that was pushing me towards something I wasn't fully ready to accept yet. Because even when you start to suspect something serious, there is still a part of you that hopes you're wrong, that everything will eventually make sense in a harmless way, that there is still a version of reality where nothing has been broken. But that version was already fading. I opened the tracking system again, not because I was looking for something specific, but because I needed to see if what I felt would be confirmed or denied. And the moment I saw the location, I knew this was no longer about imagination or stress or overthinking, because the pattern I had been trying not to believe in was happening again, in the same way, with the same silence behind it. The car wasn't where it was supposed to be, and this time I didn't try to explain it away. I didn't sit there coming up with alternatives or possibilities that could soften the reality of it, because something in me had already stopped protecting the idea that everything was fine, and instead I found myself doing something I hadn't done before in this situation, which was accepting the information exactly as it was presented, without trying to make it easier. I stayed in the car for a while, just thinking, not emotionally reacting, but processing the fact that I had reached a point where I could no longer rely on assumptions, and that if I wanted clarity, I would have to get closer to it directly instead of observing from a distance. That's when I made the decision I had been avoiding, without realizing it. I was going to find out for myself. Not through the system, not through indirect signs, not through guessing or analyzing patterns, but in a way that would remove uncertainty completely, even if the truth on the other side of that certainty was something I wasn't prepared to deal with. And the first step of that decision was Mark. Because if there was something happening, if there was a connection I was refusing to fully acknowledge, then he wasn't just part of the background anymore. He was part of the center of it. And I knew that sooner or later I would have to look at him differently. Not as someone doing a job, but as someone who might be closer to my life than I ever allowed myself to believe. So I told myself I would start paying attention more carefully, not in a paranoid way, not in an emotional way, but in a controlled, deliberate way, where I would finally stop ignoring the small signals that I had been dismissing for too long. Because at that point, I wasn't trying to imagine what was happening anymore. I was trying to confirm what I already feared was real. After I made that decision, I didn't suddenly turn into someone different or start acting in a way that would be noticeable to anyone around me, because from the outside, everything still looked exactly the same routines, the same conversations, the same normal rhythm of daily life that most people would never question. But internally, I had shifted into a completely different state of awareness, where I was no longer just living my life. I was observing it as it unfolded in real time, and that shift changes everything more than people realize. At first, I told myself I would stay rational, that I would only pay attention to what was necessary and avoid jumping to conclusions, because I still didn't want to believe that what I was thinking could actually be true. But the problem with that approach is that once you start focusing on something specific, your mind naturally begins to filter reality through that focus, and suddenly things you never noticed before start standing out in a way that feels impossible to ignore. Mark became that focus, not because he had changed, but because I had changed the way I saw him. And once that happens, even the most neutral behavior can start to feel loaded with meaning, even when there is no clear reason for it. He was still the same on the surface, still calm, still quiet, still doing his job without unnecessary conversation. But now I was noticing details that previously didn't register at all, like the way he positioned the car slightly differently when waiting outside, or the way he sometimes paused for just a fraction of a second before responding when she was mentioned. Small things that would mean nothing individually, but together started to form a pattern I couldn't fully dismiss anymore. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask him anything. Instead, I watched. Carefully, quietly, and without making it obvious in any way that would change his behavior, because I needed to see what would happen when no one knew they were being observed. And what I noticed over the next few days only made the situation more complicated in my mind, because there were moments where he seemed completely normal, almost too normal, and then there were other moments where something felt slightly off, not in a dramatic sense, but in the subtle way people behave when they are aware of something they are not supposed to show. It was never enough to prove anything, but it was never nothing either. One afternoon, I remember specifically, I got into the car earlier than usual without telling him in advance, and I could immediately feel a change in the atmosphere. Not something I could explain logically, but something that was there the moment I closed the door behind me, because he reacted just a little differently than he normally did. A fraction of a pause longer than expected before he acknowledged me, and then a tone that sounded slightly more controlled than usual when he greeted me. It wasn't obvious, but it wasn't natural either. During the drive, I tried to act completely normal, asking routine questions, speaking in the same calm tone I always used. But I started paying attention not only to his answers, but to how he gave them. Because sometimes the way someone responds tells you more than the words themselves. And I noticed that his focus on the road felt unusually fixed, almost like he was trying not to shift attention anywhere else. And then there were the mirrors. He checked them more than necessary. Not constantly, not in a way that would stand out to anyone who wasn't paying attention, but enough times that I started noticing the pattern, especially the rearview mirror, which he seemed to glance at more often than what the situation required. And every time he did it, I found myself wondering whether it was habit or something else. The strangest part was that nothing concrete was happening. Nothing that I could point to and say, this is it. But the accumulation of these small, almost invisible behaviors created a feeling that became harder and harder to ignore. Because when your mind is already in that state, silence itself starts to feel meaningful. And then came the moment that stayed with me longer than anything else. We were stopped at a light, just sitting there in traffic like any other normal day, and I happened to glance at him in the rearview mirror, and for a split second, our eyes almost met. Not directly, not fully, but enough that I noticed his reaction immediately shift away. Like he broke the connection faster than necessary, and in that brief moment, I felt something I hadn't felt before in this entire situation. Not suspicion, not confusion, but confirmation that he was also aware of something I was not saying out loud. And that changed the entire dynamic in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. Because once you reach that point, it stops being about random thoughts or overanalyzing small details, and it becomes about the unspoken reality that both sides are aware of, but neither is willing to acknowledge directly. And I realized that if I kept waiting for something obvious to happen, I might never get clarity at all. That night, I didn't think about it as much as I did before. I already knew what I had to do next. Not assume, not observe, not interpret, but act in a way that would finally remove uncertainty completely, even if the truth I discovered wasn't something I was prepared to face. Because at this point, not knowing was worse than anything I could imagine. I didn't plan to go in. I told myself I would just watch, just confirm what I already feared, and then leave before doing something I couldn't take back. But the moment I saw her car parked there and recognized Mark standing too close to her, something inside me snapped into a decision faster than my thoughts could catch up. I walked closer without even realizing how quickly I was moving, and before I could stop myself, I was already close enough to see everything clearly. Close enough to understand that there was no misunderstanding left, no maybe, or it looks like, because what I saw was exactly what my mind had been trying to avoid for weeks. They didn't notice me at first, not until it was too late. When she finally turned and saw me standing there, her face changed instantly. Like all the confidence she had a moment ago disappeared in a second, and Mark froze the same way, not speaking, not moving, just staring like he already knew there was nothing he could say that would fix what was happening. And in that moment, I didn't yell. I didn't ask questions, because everything I needed to know was already right in front of me, and the silence between us said more than any explanation ever could.